America Foundation Geopolitics of Energy Initiative. He and his wife publish an extremely provocative and well-read blog called The Race for Iran. He served as Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council, the Middle East expert, and was at the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff, and was also a Senior Analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, and it is a pleasure to have him here. We have Seth Jones, is an advisor and plan officer for the Commanding General of the U.S. Special Operations Command. Special Operations Command Policy, Special Operations, and Combating Terrorism, SCT. Seth received his PhD from the University of Chicago, I want to mention, since University of Chicago is our co-sponsor today, and very, very happy to have him. He's also the author of In the Graveyard of Empires, America's War in Afghanistan, and has served as a political scientist at the RAND Corporation. And Kori Schake, who has just flown in, is a great thinker, and we've debated and wrestled over issues for years. She's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Bradley Professor of International Security Studies at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Kori Schake served as Senior Policy Advisor for National Security for the McCain-Palin campaign, worked in the Bush White House National Security Council staff, and was responsible for policy development and outreach in the areas of foreign and defense policy for Senator John McCain. So I want to, and presidential candidate John McCain. So I want to thank all of you for being here. And I'm going to ask Kori Schake to take the helm first and share her thoughts on this subject, and then we'll move to Seth and Flint.
Thank you, my friend. I am pleased to be with you all. I think this is an important subject, and I'm a big fan of the research that Professor Pape has done. I have to say, though, that I think the policy prescriptions he draws from them are inadequate to the political purposes for which we are using force. That is, I think that by saying that the majority of attacks occur in places where American forces are deployed is simply to acknowledge what Willie Sutton said when he said that he robbed banks because that's where the money is. That is, that we put military forces around the world for political purposes, to protect ourselves and our interests, to protect our allies, to shape the world in ways we think are beneficial to our interests, to prevent groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to contest their control of territory and people. And that's what draws the attacks. So if you are willing to cede the political purposes, fair enough to say that this isn't worth doing, or to say that I would like to do it a different way. But I don't think it is by definition true that the simple presence of the troops, as opposed to the political purposes that we put them there for, is what's driving the attacks. Second point I would make is that it does seem to me non-trivial that we are not talking about all stationing of American troops everywhere in the world. We are talking about the stationing of American troops in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places where we are contesting the fight over the use of terrorism against civilian populations or against our interests. So U.S. troops in Germany are not driving attacks by Germans on the United States or on American troops. The same is true in South Korea. The same is true in lots of other places where American forces were deployed to protect our interests, protect our allies, and prevent bad things from happening. So if the first point is that it is the political purposes that we are contesting, not the simple presence of troops, that is driving the violent activity that we are engaged in. The second point is that not all stationing is the same. The third point I would make is that the strategy of offshore balancing is a parallel in some ways to the strategy of extended deterrence that we and the Europeans debated for the better part of the Cold War. For those of you who don't study transatlantic politics, the nature of that debate was that the countries that felt threatened wanted American soldiers there because that was the most binding guarantee that the United States would actually engage in the fight when the fight came. And for about 55 years or so, Germans wrung their hands about whether the United States would really be committed to the defense of Germany if there were not U.S. troops there. It is what is gruesomely called the buckets of blood strategy. Namely, if we're not dying alongside you, how can you ever be genuinely, fully confident that the United States will politically commit and see through that commitment? It does seem to me that a strategy that was cause for concern about linkage between allies as close as the United States, France, Germany, and Britain, that the questionability of our political willingness to do what we say we're going to do will be much higher in countries where we have a lot less in common and we are a lot less engaged. So you have the extended deterrence question that I think that I at least have not seen the advocates of offshore balancing adequately address how we're going to solve that problem. And the fourth concern I have is that an offshore balancing strategy, it seems to me, is inherently retaliatory. Namely, it is difficult to shape in positive ways, to lead turn problems, to engage people, to as opposed to react after something has happened. And it seems to me for the kinds of wars we are fighting, that are wars about the political shape of societies, about the role of religion in societies, about whether people feel safe enough to do what is in our interests and we believe their interests to do. That unless you are engaged in contesting and shaping that political space, it seems to me you are always going to be retaliating. And as I think Bob Pape's closing comments about drone strikes made clear, retaliatory strategies or strategies that are politically removed from the problems people are contesting in their societies. If all we are is reaching in and dropping bombs, the likelihood that people are going to consider our interests, their interests, are going to care at all about the problems that we are worried about, or are going to give us the kind of information that are going to make us successful, are much, much lower. So in conclusion, I would say that the parallel to me is not smoking in public education on lung cancer. The parallel to me is that if we are not sailing ships at sea, we won't be involved in maritime collisions. But we also won't be involved in commerce, in securing sea lines of communication, freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, and protecting and advancing American interests in the world. Offshore balancing is a strategy that removes us from engagement in the fight, and to suggest that political and economic means can create the same effect that the use of military force has. I wish that was true. I'm a big, earnest, good government type. I think whole of government operations are terrific. I wish my government was capable of it. I see my friend Ambassador Pickering sitting over there. There's nobody who has more ardently advocated building the kind of diplomatic and economic tools we need. If he thinks we have them and they can step into a greater role in this, I would be delighted to be wrong. I don't see our government acting in that way. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Corey. Seth Jones.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. What I'd like to do is, divide my comments into three segments. The first is looking very briefly at some preliminary data I put together on how and why terrorist groups end before I went into the government. Second, I'd like to focus a little bit on the Afghan-Pakistan theater and to take Bob and some other strategies and look specifically at the case of Afghanistan, and then provide some concluding remarks. I've served the last 9 or 10 years, just before and up to the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan, in Afghanistan in some capacity. So have spent a lot of time there. So this is why I'm going to focus my comments. But I'll look at some of the cases there. But I wanted to start off with this question. We do focus a lot on what causes individuals to use strategies, whether it's suicide terrorism or whether it's more conventional strategies. Ironically, the largest instruments being used against U.S. forces now and allied forces in Afghanistan are not suicide attacks today. They are more conventional improvised explosive devices or small arms fire or RPGs against U.S. helicopters, not suicide attacks, and they are not killing the largest number of Americans, at least according to the U.S. government data. But when looking, though, at why and how groups have ended historically, again, this is some data I put together just before moving into the government. What I found interesting is in looking at 648 cases since 1968 of how groups ended, what is striking is that the bulk of groups ended for one of two reasons. Either A, there was a political settlement or a negotiated settlement reached with a terrorist or insurgent group, or two, the primary focus was on what I'll call policing and intelligence agencies, covert clandestine action against terrorist groups. The percentage of cases where terrorist groups actually achieved victory was fairly small, and the percentage of cases where military forces, mostly conventional military forces, defeated a group on the battlefield was also fairly small, with one important caveat. Where we had large insurgent groups that were built and could fight like an army, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, for example, are the primary cases where one could take on military groups or terrorist groups through overt, large footprints on the ground. Now, there obviously are some outliers there, but the bulk of the data, again, suggested settlements or really covert clandestine operations, again, with the exception of large insurgent groups. What's interesting, I think, with some of that data is moving towards the Afghanistan case, because Bob sketched out a little bit the approach in Afghanistan. Started out with a small footprint and then moved increasingly to a conventional operation beginning in sort of the 2003 period and moving up to large numbers of American forces right now. I think one question to ask for the last 10 years is what policies, instruments, strategies have been most successful in Afghanistan, and I would look at I would suggest looking at two cases. One is I would look at the early period, the 9/11 period up through early 2002, and in that case, the primary focus of the strategy was U.S. mostly special forces and with SEALs and other types of special operations forces, and clandestine CIA units on the ground, with the assistance clearly of air power and eventually with some conventional units. But the focus, again, as we recall that period, was leveraging local entities, whether it was Hamid Karzai's Popalzais in the south, Ghulag Ashirzai's Barakzais in Kandahar, or it was using Dostums or other forces operating in the north. The second is a question about where we're seeing most of the successes on the ground today. That is, where have we seen areas where the Taliban has lost ground today based on their control or influence of territory last year or 2 years ago? I would say you're seeing two kinds of cases or two kinds of areas. One is some areas of Helmand where U.S. Marine forces have been operating, including districts like Garmsur. The other are a couple of key districts, including Arghandab in Kandahar. And so the question is, in these cases, because I think we're seeing some increasing Taliban penetration up in the north in Kunduz and Baghlan, but in these cases where we've seen Taliban losses, again, looking at variation in cases, what has been the reason? I think the explanation, at least my explanation sitting inside the government, is the strategy used was essentially leveraging local entities, whether it was Nurzais, or other Pashtun or other groups in Helmand. This has been a Marine Force approach. Or in the case of Special Operations Forces, leveraging local entities in Arghandab. These are mostly Alokazais. Same thing, I could lay this out in Shindan province of Herat, Paktia province of eastern Afghanistan with Chamkhanis and Jajis and other areas. Stepping back for a moment, what does this suggest to me? It suggests, and in some ways this dovetails with part of Bob's comments earlier, with which I'm quite familiar with. I think what we're seeing again is areas where the bulk of the effort against Taliban or other insurgent groups, where we're seeing the most success is a function of local elements that are pushing back. These are individuals who have a much better knowledge of the ground, a much better knowledge of tribal, sub-tribe, clan, Qawm structures and areas. And the role then of the U.S. government, especially the military, is to facilitate. Providing information, providing backup, a QRF, in some cases providing some direct action operation, but which is where the bulk of the effort is locals fighting for their communities. And so what we've seen really over the last several months is the beginnings of what I would call a major shift in U.S. policy in Afghanistan towards leveraging local institutions, communities in the east, the west, the south, and parts of the north. This is clearly part of General Petraeus' strategy. And it does go, I think, to the sense of a large American footprint if what locals see as a fight between insurgent or terrorist groups and outside forces. This is the way this fight, I think, is often portrayed rather than leveraging local entities. And let me just make some concluding remarks then on this particular area, because I would still argue what we're seeing on the intelligence side is a headquarters structure for al-Qaeda that largely exists in the Pakistan-Afghan frontiers. Arguing that this is in Pakistan, not Afghanistan, is sort of a silly argument for anybody who's been along the border area, because it's a porous border, and we've seen movement based on opportunities across both sides of the border. But I would just point out several of the more serious threats we've seen, whether it was Faisal Shahzad, Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistan, the effort to target New York City, whether it was Najibullah Azazi, whether it was the most recent threat streams we've seen, the Mumbai-style attacks in Europe, all have gone back to a core based in the Afghan-Pakistan frontier. So this area is very important still, and I think we've got to think very carefully about how we approach it. So first, just to conclude, I think the data suggests on how terrorist groups end that there is a strong argument for, in particular, a more clandestine, covert effort against terrorist groups if one can't cut a deal with them. And I think with the case of al-Qaeda, their objectives are so large that cutting a deal is well, you wouldn't want to anyway, but cutting a deal is simply not possible. Second, the U.S. has for so long looked at this Afghan case from a top-down perspective, trying to build central government institutions. This is fundamentally, in my view, the wrong way of and a misunderstanding of politics and power in Afghanistan. And then finally, again, I think this area continues to be critical. So part of these arguments, I think, do dovetail with Bob's argument, though there needs to be, as part of the strategy I think we're seeing in a range of places, a presence, a permanent presence of some kind to facilitate on the ground.
Thank you very much, Seth. I'm going to move to Flint Lever. I just brought a chair up, and I want to explain that. You know, I've just gotten back a day and a half ago from China, and I realized this was all set up wrong. I should be sitting. They should be standing. So I am going to sit, and because I know C-SPAN likes folks at the podium, and I apologize to Seth and Corey, you're welcome to sit there, Flint, or you're welcome to take the podium. But I am sitting.
Well, I'll always prefer to C-SPAN.
Thank you very much. Since Bob Pape published his first book on suicide terrorism, Dying to Win, in 2005, I have thought that his analysis of the root causes of suicide terrorism It's one of the handful of genuinely important pieces of social science scholarship to appear since the end of the Cold War. And I also think the policy implication he draws from his analysis, the imperative for the United States to return to this over-the-horizon military posture in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, is also profoundly important. The new book that Bob and James Feldman have published, I think, extends that analysis and that policy argument in some very, very powerful and timely ways. What I want to argue over the next few minutes is that the kind of recasting or recalibration of America's military posture in this part of the world, in my view, is an indispensable step, but it is only one step in what I think needs to be a much bigger reset in America's overall strategic posture in this part of the world. To pick up on Corey Shockey's point about offshore balancing basically surrendering the political purposes for which we deploy military power, I think she put her finger on something very important. What are the political purposes for which we deploy, or at least should deploy, military force in this part of the world? If the political purposes of deploying military power in the Middle East by the United States are essentially to try to maintain what is ultimately an unsustainable quest for regional hegemony, in which we are out to remake Middle Eastern societies along lines that we find ideologically more comfortable, I do not think that that is a political purpose which is worthy of American blood and treasure. I also think it is a political purpose which will, almost by definition, drive us to use military force in ways that are counterproductive in theater and over the long term strategically disastrous for America's international position. The proper political purposes of deploying military force in the Middle East and Persian Gulf, I would submit, is to engage in the prudent management of the balance of power in the region in ways that really will serve American interests. Understanding and assessing the balance of power in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf is more complicated than narrow measures of military assets and power projection capabilities can capture. Today, the United States has utterly unique capabilities to project large amounts of conventional military power into this part of the world. And we are going to continue to have those unique capabilities for as far as the eye can see. No other established or rising power in the world is capable of doing that in the Middle East. But judged by other measures of political and economic influence, the United States today, to put it frankly, is a declining power in the Middle East. It is less capable of achieving its stated policy objectives in this part of the world than was the case 10 years ago. Whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in the Arab-Israeli arena, whether it's vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran, or with regard to other regional challenges. And that has catalyzed an ongoing decline in America's strategic standing in this critical part of the world. In this regard, I think that the observation made by former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage after he left government, his observation was that there's certainly nothing new about regional governments, regional players, societal actors in the Middle East not liking various aspects of the substance of American policy in that part of the world. But now, for the first time, more and more constituencies that matter in the region are questioning our competence to achieve the policy objectives we set for ourselves in this part of the world, and that is a very important and, I think, disturbing development. As America's regional influence and effectiveness have declined, others have taken advantage of the same strategic developments and U.S. policy mistakes that are undermining the American position in the region to boost their own position. American policymakers, analysts, typically like to divide the region between moderates, people who are interested in stability, and radicals, whose presumed, guiding light, raison d'etre, is to sow instability in the region. But it would be just as accurate in terms of the way that many constituencies in the region actually talk about these things, to divide the region between those actors who are willing to accept and even to legitimate in some ways the aspirations of the United States and/or Israel for various types of regional hegemony, versus those actors and players who are not prepared to accept that or legitimate it and even define their own political agendas in terms of resisting those hegemonic aspirations. And to put it bluntly, over the last decade, if you look at the relative balance of power in the region between those in the region who are prepared to accept, work with, even legitimate American and/or Israeli hegemony in the region, the balance of power over the last decade has shifted in relative terms toward, in favor of, the resistance camp. And this has very little to do with military power. Look in the Arab-Israeli arena, what has happened. In Lebanon, over the last decade, Hezbollah has emerged not just as an increasingly capable paramilitary force, which it is, but it has emerged as the single most disciplined, effective, and genuinely popular political party in Lebanese politics. The conventional view in Washington that in last year's parliamentary elections in Lebanon, that Saad Hariri's March 14 movement beat Hezbollah ignores an unpleasant reality. If you actually look at the number of votes cast in that election, March 8, the Hezbollah coalition won roughly 55% of the votes cast. They won at least a couple of 100,000 more votes than the Hariri coalition. But because, under the rubric of Lebanese democracy, Shia votes don't count as much as Maronite votes, Hariri's coalition ended up with more seats in the parliament. But Hariri still has to have a unity government with Hezbollah if he's going to have any chance of staying in office. Hezbollah has become an absolutely integral and strategically important player in Lebanese politics. The same could be said in broad terms about Hamas in Palestine. Nobody raises any questions about the legitimacy of that election that Hamas won. It was internationally observed. Hamas won because it represents constituencies that cannot be ignored and that have legitimate grievances for which Hamas speaks. We have still the lovely delusion that by getting Fatah to negotiate with Israel, we might actually achieve a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, good night. You are not going to be able to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict without Hamas being centrally involved on the Palestinian side. You are not going to be able to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict by trying to do it in a way that is deliberately designed to, quote-unquote, marginalize Iran in the region. Iran's allies are going to be front and center in any genuine settlement to this conflict. As I said, I think that the shift back to offshore balancing has to be part of a bigger reset. What else needs to be there? Okay? I'll tick off three things and then I'll stop. One, this won't come as any surprise to anyone who's followed the work that I've done over the last few years, mostly with my wife and frequent co-author Hilary Mann Leverett about Iran. I think it is indispensable that the United States realigns its relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran as fundamentally and comprehensively as it realigned its relations with the People's Republic of China in the early 1970s. I won't belabor this point right now. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you like, but I will simply underscore that at this point, the United States cannot achieve any of its own stated high-priority policy objectives in the Middle East, in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, elsewhere. We can't do it absent a more positive and productive strategic relationship with the Islamic Republic. Second, the United States needs to pursue a genuinely regional strategy for post-conflict stabilization in Afghanistan. This means more than just a professed willingness to talk with Iran and others about Afghanistan, based on what is frankly a simple-minded proposition that because the Iranians cooperated with us in Afghanistan after 9/11, they would unreflectively do so again. I say this proposition is simple-minded because it overlooks an important reality. The Iranians think that the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan has shifted away from the strategy initially pursued there in coordination with them during 2001 to 2003. The U.S. strategy that has emerged in Afghanistan is interpreted by the Iranians as either fundamentally incoherent or, to the extent that it has some coherence, is aimed deliberately at important Iranian interests. More specifically, the Iranians think that the Obama administration's gradual embrace of engagement with the Taliban is dangerous nonsense. As one senior Iranian official put it to me, if the United States wants to strike a deal with the Taliban, why did it invade Afghanistan in the first place? We're going to have a genuinely regional strategy in which, yes, at this point, we probably are going to have to engage the Taliban, in no small part because of some colossal strategic blunders we made in Afghanistan in 2001 to 2003. But we are going to need the Iranians and others at the table with their allies to create a genuinely balanced power-sharing arrangement in Afghanistan that might allow that situation to move on in a manageable way. Third, the United States needs a completely new approach to Arab-Israeli peacemaking. We don't have the right actors at the table. We don't have a genuinely comprehensive approach. We're trying to use Arab-Israeli peacemaking to deal with too many other regional challenges, and we're not dealing with the really fundamental issues at stake in this conflict. We are going to have to pursue a genuinely comprehensive approach to Arab-Israeli peacemaking in which we stop playing tracks off one another, in which we stop trying to play Arab-Israeli diplomacy off against Iran, and in which we are willing to deal with all relevant actors. In conclusion, and to circle back where I started, please read and even memorize the new book from Bob and James Feldman. After you memorize it, if you're a policymaker, please act on it. If you are, like me, an ordinary citizen, I would encourage you to focus whatever level of effort you make at political activism on petitioning your government to implement their recommendations. You'd be doing a real service to your country, and that's certainly what Bob has done in this new book. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. These are three outstanding presentations coming through very different portals at this question. And when I looked at the question, which was strategy in the Middle East, I realized how inadequate the question was to what we just got, because when you look at it, it's very much an arc of concern and instability, really from North Africa, the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, into, of course, South Asia, which we talked about. I want to open the floor. We're going to have lunch for you shortly. Most of you know that I never give people breaks. We usually like to feed people at their seats, which we're not allowed to do in this great room, sort of the congressional bomb shelter, if you will. They're trying to keep it nice. We're going to have to break. And then Thomas Kane, the former 9/11 commissioner, will be here. But as we get ready, as you guys think about questions, I do want to pose at least one question that brings us back into the question of Afghanistan and also Iran. When I go around the world, I think Flint is right. At some level, America is sort of the General Motors of countries. It has lots of capacity, but that capacity isn't convincing many other nations that we have the same kind of capacity or promise in the future that, say, China does. And one of the drags, I think, on American power, on the perception of American power, in my view, is what we've seen in 9 years in Afghanistan, is the sense that we're not achieving results. Mm-hmm. And, Corey, you may recall that you wrote a very interesting comment along with Bruce Riedel, John Nagel, Parag Khanna, and Brian Katulis during the strategic review on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And you had, it was in the Washington Post, you had significant doubts about the strategic course we were going and about the big upsurge in the number of troops. In fact, you were a skeptic, Parag Khanna was a skeptic, and Brian Katulis was a skeptic. Bruce Riedel and John Nagel were the advocates at that time. And Seth, I don't know if you were in that mix as well, but it was, I guess my question is, do you still agree with the positions that you had then, Corey? Has it gone the way you thought? And Seth, in this broader question, because you brought such granular detail and understanding to what's going well or poorly, is not to say that's in the weeds because you're looking at performance in the ground, but what are the broader strategic consequences of the time and effort and resources in Afghanistan does Special Operations Command look at in that region? Is Afghanistan looked at as it's leveraging American power and options in the region, or is it a drag on the perception of America's abilities? So just quick comments, and then I want to go to the floor. Corey? Is that on?
Sorry, operator error. My concern about the president's strategy in Afghanistan wasn't whether it's worth doing. I believe it is worth doing. I think it's important to our interests. I think we have a moral responsibility given what we have started in Afghanistan, and I think the second-order effects of not seeing it through to a successful conclusion would be extraordinarily damaging to the country. My concern about the president's Afghanistan review and the policy that came out of it is that I agree with the objectives that he has set and the importance he accords to them. I don't think the resources he is willing to commit to it match up to what he's trying to achieve. And principally in that regard, I think, is time. I think it has been extraordinarily damaging both to our interests broadly and to the war effort more narrowly that the administration set the 18-month timeline. I'm pleased to see, I think as a function of, I think they made a strategic choice as a function of personnel appointments, namely with the appointment of General Petraeus and General Mattis. I think the administration effectively relaxed their 18-month constraint on time, and I think that's a good thing. The second concern I had about the president's strategy in Afghanistan is our exit strategy, if you will, is that we will draw down when Afghanistan has the capacity to do the things we are doing now. And I have grave doubts about the matchup between the timeline that the president was imposing and Afghan capacity to get there at the speed that we believe. Moreover, I think I am not alone in having grave doubts about whether the Karzai administration shares our objectives to such an extent that that we can be successful without greater effort on their part. I myself struggle, spend a lot of time thinking about whether there are more cost-effective strategies for achieving what we want. And I go back and forth on this, to be honest, that it does seem to me that a slower commitment of resources over a longer period of time might match up more closely with the absorptive capacity of the Afghans to take over these missions. But I'm quite sympathetic to the fundamental strategic argument of the surge, which is you've got to change the security dynamic to change the political dynamic. And only once you have done that are people going to look at the problem in different ways.
Thanks, Corey. Seth?
Sure, I'll step back and address the more strategic issue right now that you asked. I mean, I think part of the question as you look strategically across the Middle East and South Asia is for either balance of power or balance of threat rationale. When the United States decides to deploy the military instrument or military instruments in addition to others, what are the best options available? And I would say what I believe we have learned over the past decade since 9/11 is that the use of large-scale conventional forces, that is a large footprint, is appropriate when you're dealing with a conventional military. So whether it would be a Taiwan scenario, and one's talking about naval forces, whether it was targeting the Iraq regime per se, whether or not you think it was a good idea, the use of conventional forces, I think, tends to be appropriate. But when you're dealing with terrorist groups, insurgent groups for the most part, I think what we've learned is in general, and I would say the Iraq experience in Anbar supports this, the U.S. experience now in Afghanistan now supports this, is a large presence of American forces in the ground to try and, quote, win it for locals tends not to be the best use of American military power. Rather, the use of what I would call more covert or clandestine efforts to leverage legitimate local actors tends to be more an appropriate use of the military instrument in those cases where one is talking about a terrorist or an insurgent group. And where this issue becomes a little complex is when you're dealing with countries like Afghanistan with a very, very weak central government, weak national security forces, and a long history in Pashtun areas of local policing traditions. So to try and ramrod this through the central government in all cases, I think is a very Western concept in that area. So part of, I think, at the strategic level is I think we've learned a lot of lessons on the military instrument, what has worked and what hasn't. And again, when we're dealing with terrorist groups for the most part, I would say we're looking more at clandestine, this is CIA or special operations entities as the primary instrument overseas.
Seth, thank you. Flint, any comments?
Yeah. I think this the conversation we're having about Afghanistan right now, it's to a large extent reflective of the conversation we have about Afghanistan as a country right now, is utterly devoid of either a defined political goal or serious discussion of the dynamics of Afghan politics. What is the goal? What is the point that we want to reach in terms of a political state in Afghanistan where we would feel like, okay, we have achieved our objective and we can move on. And how do you get to that political state? I think for a lot of the reasons that Seth just described, I don't think there really is a security solution to this. You know, I don't care if we went 18 months, I don't care if we went 5 years. There's not a security solution to this. There is a political solution, at least in theory, that is based on power sharing among all of the relevant ethnic constituencies in Afghanistan. And at this point, as I said, because of mistakes we made early on in Afghanistan, the Taliban is going to have to be part of that mix. But we're also going to have a lot of other players in the mix. You know, Iranians and others look at Karzai moving toward some kind of settlement with the Taliban, and they see that as very, very bad for their interests. It empowers the Taliban's Pakistani and Saudi patrons, puts pressure on the interests of other players in Afghanistan and in the neighborhood. It's a very, very bad outcome. If we let that kind of things drift down that road, what we're going to get is a resumption of real civil war in Afghanistan. The way to stop that and the way to let us get out is a power sharing arrangement. But that's going to take a genuinely regional strategy. We're going to need the Iranians helping us with this. We're going to need other players helping us with this. And we're not even talking about that in a serious way. And, you know, frankly, I think that means, you know, more American soldiers are going to die in Afghanistan. More money is going to get wasted there for I'm not really sure what purpose.
Let me open the floor. I'm going to cluster a few questions because we need to get you guys fed and back in this room. So I'm going to cluster a few questions. This gentleman right here, if we can run a mic to you real quickly. And if you'll ask one of the three questions you have, you'll make me really happy. Okay, this gentleman, then this gentleman. Go ahead.
My name's Dan Caldwell. I'm professor of political science at Pepperdine University. And I would be interested, Dr. Jones, if you would comment on whether there's an analogous group or groups in Afghanistan to the Sons of Iraq in Iraq that Professor Pape commented on in terms of your emphasis on leveraging local groups.
Thank you. And this gentleman just behind.
Thank you. Mike Billington from Executive Intelligence Review. None of you have mentioned the narco side of narco-terrorism. And yet, as I'm sure you know, the Russians have, especially Viktor Ivanov, their drug czar, has declared Afghanistan to be essentially a second British opium war, with the massive flow of drugs out of the British-controlled area of Afghanistan until recently.
I want you to move to the question.
Very quick. Yeah. The problem is that the U.S. administration under Obama has basically said we shouldn't take on the drug issue, we want to focus on terrorism. General Jones, just 2 days before he was fired or resigned, gave a very powerful speech in Russia, fully endorsing the Russian call for a global collaborative effort on fighting drugs, fighting international crime, and the sophisticated interface with international business. So I'd very much like to hear your comments on that.
Thank you. Right down here.
Hello, Samira Daniels. This is for Seth Jones. What operation would you characterize as having been the most successful in the vein that you would like to see happen in Afghanistan?
Thank you. And then this gentleman in the middle. We'll just do this, and I'll come back to the middle in a bit.
Hi, I'm Derek Flood with the Jamestown Foundation. I'm wondering if, this is for anybody, as far as creating democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan, I worked with Dr. Abdullah on the presidential campaign trail last year, and he felt that he had to play his mixed Tajik Pashtun identity to, depending on where he was going, where he was traveling linguistically and ethnically in Afghanistan. And in Iraq, there's a sense that we need to have someone from the majority population, i.e. a Shia. So with the religious divisions in Iraq and the ethnic divisions in Afghanistan, we're actually creating more of Lebanese-style democracies rather than an actual genuine democracy. In other words, no one would say that an Assyrian Christian could rule Iraq or that a Hazara or an Uzbek would rule Afghanistan. And this is for, if anyone wants to comment, if that's really the way to go, as far as a lot of local people think that's not a Western-style democracy.
Great. I've got to hold the rest of the questions because I'm getting the hook back here, but during lunch and whatnot, we'll have an opportunity to talk more. But I will turn to Corey and Seth and then Flint for responses.
2 quick points. First, I agree with your judgment that we're missing a huge opportunity for cooperation, not just with Russia, but with Iran, with China, with other countries who are concerned about narcotics and drugs in and out of Afghanistan. It does seem to me someplace we could really make cooperative profit together soon. On the question of are we creating real democracies, I don't think I view the Iraq example the same way that you do, because it does seem to me that one of the costs Iraq is paying for the diminished interest by the United States and the accelerated drawdown of our forces and concomitant lack of interest the Obama administration has taken in Iraq is that a very positive trend, which is post-sectarian political organization, that we saw occurring in Iraq over the course of the year before the parliamentary elections. I think it's much more brittle now. That Ayad Alawi slate had Sunni support, although he is not Sunni, that lots of candidates saw the opportunity, even Kurdish candidates, in moving beyond sectarian pools of voters, I think was an extraordinarily positive sign that the water is receding on now.
Thanks. On the first question on the Sons of Iraq question, local politics, obviously the Iraq and Afghan cases are different. You know that. But just to answer your question, the tribal structures in Afghanistan have evolved a lot over the last 30 years of warfare. In my view, spending a lot of time out in rural areas, what exists today is certainly intact at the tribal, sub-tribe, clan, quam level in some areas. In others, it's been degraded somewhat for a whole range of reasons, including targeted assassination. But I think what is consistent in Pashtun areas of the country, and most of the insurgency, not entirely, is in Pashtun areas, politics remains very local. So the power brokers, tribal leaders tend to be very localized. And what you see in a range of areas, with Nurzais in the west, Al-Quzais in the south, Jajis and Chamkhanis in the east, is a fair amount of deep-seated unhappiness with Taliban or other insurgent groups. So a lot of resistance potential, I would say. On the examples of what one would use from over here, I'd say one of the most interesting examples is if you go back about a year and a half ago, Arghandab in just outside of Kandahar city was heavily penetrated by the Taliban after the death of Mullah Naqib. Al-Quzais had fractured. You've had a 180-degree turn in Arghandab right now. The Taliban have largely been kicked out of most of the district, and it's been for a whole range of reasons. One of them is the Al-Quzais have risen up against Taliban forces in the area. It's been a locally generated effort with support from the Afghan government and with ISAF forces, using a very small footprint, but a very lethal one. Thanks.
Thank you, Seth. Flint. I'm okay. Well, I want to thank everyone here. I'm really getting the hook. We have the privilege of Governor Thomas Kean, co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission, joining us right after what I consider a BlackBerry break. Go check your BlackBerries. Grab a sandwich. I don't think we give you any seats. You can't exactly get too situated. And come back and join us at 12:30. Thank you very much. Please welcome and thank Flint Leverett, Corey Shockey, and Seth Jones.
See ya.